So last Sunday evening, we finished up our study on discipleship. And so as I mentioned, that means today we will start into our study on 2 Kings. And with that, I know there was an introduction that was done when Jared started 1 Kings, but that's been a little while now. And so we will do a little bit of an introduction, maybe not quite as in-depth as what we might if this were just the start of a new book entirely. Because if you recall through that, really originally 1st and 2nd Kings were one book. And so we have it broken into two books, and that's helpful for us as we go through and study, but it's also good that we remember this is just continuing the same history where we left off in 1 Kings. And actually, once we get into our study of chapter 1 after a while, we'll kind of see how that really connects, looking at the end of 1 Kings into 2 Kings 1, that it just is continuing on in that history and that narrative there. But you'll see I have this titled, The Fall of the Nation, because really in 2 Kings, that's where everything is heading to. Of course, we know from 1 Kings what happened to the kingdom. The kingdom divided, right? After Solomon, you have Rehoboam, Jeroboam. The kingdom divides into two. So you have Judah and you have Israel. Well, Israel is going to fall before Judah does, but by the end of 2 Kings, Judah is going to fall as well. And so we see all of that going through the study of 2 Kings. Of course, everything's been working toward that, even once you go back into 1 Kings. But that's kind of the overall idea, at least in my mind, when we look at the study of 2 Kings. So a few things we're going to talk about as we move through this particular introduction, and try to kind of get our minds wrapped around where we are headed. First, I want to talk a little bit about the authorship of the book of 2 Kings. Anybody want to take a stab at who they think the author is?
God.
Okay, Aaron, you got right to the point, right? Yes, 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17 there. We know all Scripture is what? Given by inspiration of God, profitable for doctrine, reproof, correction, for instruction and teaching in righteousness. And so we know that the source of these things is God Himself, that there's benefit in it for our study. You can think as well about 2 Peter 1, 20 and 21. When you look at those particular verses there, it talks about how no prophecy is of private interpretation, but holy men of God spoke as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. So we know the source is God. The way it gets to man is by the Holy Spirit. But as far as man, who might we think?
I have it was possibly written by Ezra or Jeremiah.
Right, and that's kind of what history says. Jewish tradition tends to lean towards Jeremiah, but also there are those who would say maybe Ezra. And those are just, guesses. You read through 1st and 2nd Kings and you don't actually see anybody saying that they're the ones who wrote the book. But the thought maybe of Jeremiah, because he kind of excludes himself. You read through the book of Jeremiah, there's a lot that takes place during some of the things we're going to read in 2 Kings, but you don't read about Jeremiah in 2 Kings. And so that's a thought of some that he recorded this history down. And of course Ezra as well, because of the time frame of when things would have been written. And so that's just, again, possibility. Who it was exactly doesn't really make a difference. Because again, back to Aaron's point, we know it's all from God. Now we're going to notice as we go through 2 Kings and some things that Jared had brought out in 1 Kings, I know it came up in 1 and 2 Samuel as well, is there are times at which through the study you will see a mention of another book. Sometimes it talks about the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, and that's different from 1st and 2nd Chronicles that we have recorded here in the Bible. Sometimes you'll see something about like the book of Jasher, books such as that. Those were just separate history books they had at that time that they could refer to and access, but they were not inspired books. All right, and so there's history there they could go to, turn and see, but what we need to know is recorded right here for us. And so we'll talk some more about some of that whenever those things come up in our study, kind of as we go through. But I thought I'd at least kind of mention that now. So we know 1st and 2nd Kings, who the author there is, ultimately getting to God. As far as a review, just try to think back through, all the history of Israel. Of course, we could go all the way back to Genesis, right, and see where it all begins. You go through Genesis, and then you find, when you come into Exodus, what happens to the people?
They're enslaved.
Right, they're enslaved in Egypt. And the book of Exodus is about God doing what for his people?
Freeing his people.
Freeing them from Egypt, right? Bringing them out and then helping to establish law for them. Then you get into Leviticus. And Leviticus, you see all about the priesthood. You find more about those laws. Then you get into Numbers. And in Numbers, you find that the people didn't really follow those laws very well. Deuteronomy is just a recap of those things. Moses is essentially giving a series of sermons and warning them because of how it is they messed up originally and saying the next generation needs to make sure they get it right. Then you come into Joshua, and what happens in Joshua?
Which part?
At least the beginning.
They take the land.
Right. They go and they conquer the promised land. Of course, God is the one, it says multiple times through the book of Joshua, how God gave them the land. God gave the enemies over to them. So by the grace of God, they are able to conquer the promised land. They received the land promise. Aaron, you talked about that in your Devo Wednesday night. And so we recognize how that goes, and you get to the end of the book of Joshua. Joshua knows he is about to die, and he's speaking to the people, and he gives them a great charge, or rather he puts a challenge to them. Choose for yourself this day whom you will serve. Who do the people say they're going to serve? God. It's interesting if you look at that whole section in Joshua 24, because they say they're going to serve the Lord God, and Joshua says, are you sure? Do you really want to do that? Because don't you know who he is? And the people are adamant. They say, we want to serve God and him only. And then you turn a page or two and you get into Judges, and what happens?
They knew not God no more.
They didn't know God anymore, right? But God still loved his people. He'd raise up deliverers for them. But we see consequences of sin. If we're not faithful to God, it's not going to be long before the bad things start coming. And so that's just, in short, looking at the book of Judges. Then you come into the book of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel, what do we find?
People want a king.
They want a king. Why do they want a king? Who do they want to be like?
Nations around them.
They want to be like every other nation. They want to have a king. And then who's chosen to be king? Saul. Now, Samuel, I almost said Solomon. Samuel, he's not too happy about it, is he? But he knows what's going to happen. Even if you go back in the book of Deuteronomy, and some things we'll bring out going through the study, in Deuteronomy, there are certain things that were said that the king needed to do. It was known all along, Israel was eventually going to want to be like everybody else and want a king. And that happened in the days of Samuel. And so Saul's the first king, and how do things go?
Not so good. Well, good at first.
Good at first, but then eventually Saul starts kind of doing his own thing, right? He thinks that he doesn't have to fully follow the law of God, that he can kind of partially follow it, but that doesn't work out for him, does it?
What is the bleeding in my ears?
And so you get there to 1 Samuel 15, and you see how all of that takes place. Then you come to 1 Samuel 16, and what do we find happen? Someone else is anointed who's going to eventually become king, right? And who is that? David. But it takes a while before David becomes king. And so from 1 Samuel 16 to the end of 1 Samuel, there's a lot of conflict, isn't there? Because King Saul doesn't like David, does he? And everything King Saul does is to go ahead and get rid of David.
He does it first.
And, well, he likes David at first, but then eventually things change, right? And so then we see how it is. You get to the end of 1 Samuel, Saul dies in that battle with the Philistines, and then you come into 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel is all about who?
David.
It's all about David. First few chapters is basically showing how it took a little bit of time still after the death of Saul for David to become king over all of Israel. So even at that point early on, we can still see that there were signs of division brewing within the kingdom. The people were not concerned with God, but they start to get more concerned with politics and being like everybody else. There's problems within that. But then, of course, as everything goes on, early on in David's reign, how are things going for Israel?
Good.
Everything's going really good, right? David was a good king. He's a man after God's own heart. But did David make his mistakes along the way? And what's the primary mistake we think of that we read about in 2 Samuel chapter 11? With Bathsheba, which leads to the murdering of her husband Uriah and covering everything up there. 2 Samuel 12, you see all the consequences that are going to come. And then, of course, you go on from that point, and basically what you find is David dealing with all the consequences of his sin. Primarily, the consequences are coming from within his own family. And so that gets you through the end of 2 Samuel. And then you come into 1 Kings that Jared taught us, here not too terribly long ago. But you look at the beginning of 1 Kings, well, it's perspective, Aaron. But you look at the beginning of 1 Kings, and what do we find? David's an old man, right? He's about to die, and there's still problems in his family, aren't there? But who is David told that he needs to anoint to be the next king of the people? Solomon. So then you find Solomon become king. You see in the early years of Solomon, how's everything going? Everything's going great. Israel has never been wealthier. The temple is built, and so you suspect within that they've never been closer to God. But by the time you read about the end of Solomon's reign, what had Solomon been doing?
Setting up idol temples of other gods.
All because of the foreign wives that he had married. And so you see that even though there were all of these good things going on in the background, there were still things that were happening that should not have been happening. Well, Solomon, he dies, and then what happens? We mentioned it just a little bit ago. You have Rehoboam and Jeroboam. The kingdom divides. So you then have the capital of Judah going to stay in Jerusalem. Capital of Israel. Eventually, the northern kingdoms ends up being in Samaria in that particular region. But from that point on, 1 Kings chapter 12 is where the kingdom divides. All the way to the end of that particular chapter is where we see just problem after problem after problem. But we also find something else within 1 Kings that really starts to stand out. Of course, the book itself is called The Kings, and so we tend to focus specifically on the kings. But who else plays a huge factor within these books? Elijah.
And Elisha.
Elisha. So we're talking about the prophets. Right? The book is just as much about the prophets as it is about the kings. So really, 1 Kings chapter 17 is where you start to see Elijah jump onto the scene. Of course, if we think about Elijah, if you're like me, you generally are going to think about 1 Kings chapter 18. Anybody remember what happens there?
He calls on the prophets of Baal.
Right, he challenges the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. And who's proven to be the true God?
God Himself.
God Himself.
Yahweh.
Baal is out on vacation somewhere, sleeping, doing whatever, because he's not real, right? And that's what's shown there within 1 Kings 18. But we also can think about the good lesson from McElyea in 1 Kings chapter 22. Anybody remember the particular lesson that we learned from McElyea in 1 Kings 22?
Back to the word.
Going to speak the truth. Doesn't matter what anyone else says. Doesn't matter what all the false prophets might be saying that pleases the ears of the king. But I can only speak the truth. I can only speak what God has spoken. And that's a valuable lesson for us. I know Jared had great application on that when we hit that particular chapter. Then, of course, as we also mentioned in there, you have Elisha. You first find Elisha in 1 Kings chapter 19. But Elisha comes more on the scene once we get into 2 Kings. Now, first we're going to see Elijah, but then we'll see the transition from Elijah to Elisha as we start moving through the early chapters. But hopefully that review kind of helps get our minds back on the history of Israel, to recognize where Israel has been to where they are now at this point that we are about to start our study. And I think it's important that we can always try to keep that history in mind. Because we know from history that it does what? It repeats itself. And so we have to make sure that we don't repeat it for ourselves. Do the best we can to change that cycle. I have in here an overview. Basically, my overview is what I mentioned in the title, that you're going to eventually see the fall of the nations here. Everything is working toward the point that Israel's going to fall and be taken captive. And then the same is going to happen for Judah. And so that really kind of gets you an overview of the book of 2 Kings. Why should we study the book? Why does it matter? What thoughts might we have?
History matters.
All right, history matters.
History repeats itself.
It repeats itself, but we live under the New Testament, don't we?
Oh,
To help to know the mind of God. Still the same God.
Still the same God, and as Kay said, helps us know the mind of God better. The Old Testament's important for our learning, is it not? That we look at these lessons of old and we see their history and we see these people and we start to see ourselves within that. Because human nature hasn't changed, has it? We still have the same struggles that they did in that time frame. So as we study out this history, we're going to start to learn some things about ourselves and find the areas that we need to be working on and improving in.
not to promote this show, it's a decent show. There's this House of David show that we're watching now, and it's going through Samuel losing his anointing over Agag and all that stuff. But I loved it at the beginning because it says these are depictions of historical, and it says that this is history, and some of it's been changed to make drama, you know. But I love that they at least acknowledged that this was historical events. And for a world that we live in now who just wants to say that the Bible isn't history, that it's stories and tales, I thought it was really cool that it said these are historical events. And we must remember that when studying the Bible, this isn't stuff that's made up. This is history.
Yeah.
And if you gotta cherish the history so that, as you said, we don't repeat it. But
I was going to wait a second to pass these out, but you're giving me a good opportunity to pass it out.
There you go.
Talking about history. So Jimmy and Ty are about to come around, and on this particular paper, it's front and back, but this is a timeline of the kings with the kind of the date, rough date of when these things happened. And to Aaron's point, when Aaron talks about how we know this is history, we can be fairly confident about the particular dates that are given here in the time frame because of history. We're going to see as we go through 2 Kings especially that there are different kings of foreign nations that are mentioned and certain conquests and things of that nature where there have been archaeological discoveries that show these things were so. And I think we should have time actually to talk about one of those here in just a moment. But to try and explain, what you're looking at there, to make sure you're looking at the front of it, underneath on the far left side where it talks about Bible references, it should have 1 Samuel 16:1 there. That's the start of it all. And then it's going to have the kings of Judah and Israel to begin with in the United Kingdom. Of course, it doesn't have Saul on there. It just begins with David. You got to recognize some of this is just due to space. But of course, within that, it starts with David on this particular list. And you can look over, keep going right, and you see who the prophets were at that time, kind of the rough time frame, and then who the kings of the foreign nations would have been. And so this is just something, for your benefit as we go through, as you're reading through at home, to kind of help keep things in line, especially once you get down into the divided kingdom, because in 2 Kings, we're going to be jumping back and forth a lot. And sometimes it's hard to remember, okay, who is the king in Israel? Who's the king in Judah? Sometimes it's just kind of hard to keep that straight, at least in my mind. And also where it gets helpful is on the backside. Once you start getting into some of the conquests and the captivity and things of that nature, where you start seeing more of those names. So you got the kings of Assyria, and then it gets down to Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, and then of course you can kind of see who's in Egypt going through all of that. And anyway, hopefully this is helpful to you. I know it's helpful for me, so I thought I'd share that with you. But yes, so Aaron's point, this is all history. And like I say, we'll talk about some of the archaeological finds and things of that nature as we get into it. And so let's think some more about why a study of the Old Testament matters here. Johnny, you had something?
Well, I was going to say, the Old Testament shows us who God is, contrary to what people want to believe now, that He's a loving God who wouldn't do anything bad to us. But it shows us that God rewarded good choices and he condemns bad choices.
And that's why keeping that overall history of Israel in mind is important. When things were going well for Israel, God blessed them abundantly. I mean, you look at everything that God does in giving it to his people in the conquest of the land. They didn't deserve it. They didn't know how to fight, yet God continually gave them all of those good things to bring about his purpose. Well, keep that in mind whenever we start to see the fall of the nation over here, because God was patient with them and put up with him for a very long time before these things came to be. But it shows he's true to his word. And like you mentioned, we see the goodness, but we're also going to see some of that severity looking through. So that's a good thought. Brother Alvin?
That first shows is to confirm the word.
Yes.
In the New Testament, they had the Spirit and it was working. But we can see also by the Old Testament, the Spirit was still working.
Absolutely, and we see that abundantly when we look at Elijah, when we look at Elisha, and we're going to see, it's interesting, I don't remember offhand exactly how many, but you see more miracles coming from Elisha than you do Elijah. And that happens in these early chapters here in 2 Kings, and there's a reason for it. But like you say, it shows the power, and it helps to confirm that word. And the prophets definitely use the power of the Spirit in order to help bring that confirmation about. Jared?
You kind of mentioned it a while ago, but the continual idea about God's people wanting to be like people around them, and the things that influence them, things that pull them away from God. And it's almost similar to other times you see in the Old Testament, a pattern that keeps repeating itself.
Mm-hmm.
And even the very idea of how a wicked king, sinful king, can have an impact on the entire nation.
Yeah.
And just how that kind of filters through the entirety of the people, and it's just kind of again and again.
Right.
Typically pointed to that wanting to be like everybody
Mhm.
else, being influenced by the world.
Yeah, and so if you didn't hear Jared just mentioning, looking at some of these things of how we can see the impact that one king can have on the entire nation. And you see the continual cycle of it because the overwhelming majority of the kings were what? Good or bad? They were bad. And how'd that impact the nation? Overall, everybody else just kind of did whatever the king did, right? They're the leader. They're the one who has the power. They can take my life. They can take my job. I'm just going to kind of do what they do. And of course, if the leader is not doing what he needs to do, if the things being taught are not being taught, because think back to Ahab when you have everything there and McElyea and, they don't want to hear the truth. And you have all the false prophets that say whatever sounds good. You got to be careful. So there's a good lesson in that for us. And some of the things we'll try to bring out going through as it applies is think about leadership, right? It's important that we have the right men leading the way. Because you see what happened in Israel when they had the wrong men leading the way. And so that's a valuable lesson. Aaron?
Just as the overall, when you say, why do we study the Old Testament? I always like this saying, I don't know who come up with it, some smart preacher who said, the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed.
Mm-hmm.
And the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. And so the more you know about the Old Testament, the more you'll understand what's so important about the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
And the more you study the New Testament, the more you'll see how important it was that you know the Old Testament.
Yes.
Because it's showing God's promises and His love and how He will always... you can't have one without the other because you wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
have a New Testament unless there was
Without
an
the
Old
Old.
Testament.
Right.
So, so it's just, it's not that we're under that law, but
Mhm.
if you don't understand that law in the Old Testament, then you're not going to have a full understanding of the New Testament.
Yes, yes. Let's go, Johnny, and then I've got one other thing I wanted to mention on it, and then we'll move into looking at chapter 1.
I was going to say, throughout the Old Testament, we see that the majority is not always right.
Yes. Right, yeah, truth is not always in numbers, right? Truth is always going to be where?
And truth,
In the truth. And the truth is God's Word. And so whether everybody believes it or whether you only have one person standing up to speak it, truth is still truth regardless of who and regardless of how many. So that's a good thought there. The one thing I wanted to bring up, and we've sort of been working our way around it. When you look at the Old Testament, who do we know in the Old Testament are the chosen people of God? Israel, right? As a whole, the Israelites are the chosen people of God. What reason is it? Because who's going to come from them, through them?
Genesis 49:10.
All right, it's all working toward Jesus, right? We get into the New Testament. In the New Testament, who do we find are the chosen people of God?
Christians.
It's the Christians. It's the church, right? It's no longer physical Israel, but it is now spiritual Israel. You look in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 16, and it talks about how we are the Israel of God. With that in mind, and thinking back to the lessons of the Old Testament, it's easy for us to look and to see and try to separate ourselves out from these things, but it's there for a reason. Like we've been saying, these things are history. History repeats itself. It helps us come to know God better, to see the mind of God better, to see His goodness, to see His severity, to learn the value of having good leaders leading the way. Right? The lessons that we find in the Old Testament, there might be some application there to our nation as a whole, but really and truly, who's the application to?
Each individual.
It's to us as the church. It's to the Israel of God, right? And so as we read through and study through the Old Testament, let's not separate ourselves from it. Yes, we can make application to other things, but more importantly, we need to be making the application to ourselves as Christians, to ourselves as the church. Because if we can't get these lessons down, we're going to repeat the same things that they did and find ourselves in the same problems and situations that they did. And so with that in our minds, let's go ahead and jump into chapter 1 now. We're not going to be able to get through the entirety of the chapter, but we can at least start it. And so 2 Kings chapter 1, what I've titled this particular chapter is The King Who Did Not Believe in God. It's not that we ever see that he says he doesn't believe in God, but it's going to be through his action that we find he didn't believe in God. And we can see perhaps some of ourselves in what this particular king does.
You have a day on 2 Kings.
It's going to be roughly from about 850-ish, 870 to 850, going through about 580-ish. Yeah. That's kind of, like I say, that's good idea, rough estimate of where the dates would be, and we can come pretty close to it based on some of the discoveries and things like that that have been found. The 2 Kings chapter 1, as I mentioned here, the king who did not believe in God. And so with this, let's start. Verses 1 and 2 kind of sets the stage for us, and we'll find ourselves immediately in the midst of misfortune. 2 Kings chapter 1, if somebody could read verses 1 and 2.
Moab rebelled against Israel after the death of Ahab. Now, Ahaziah fell through the lattice of his upper room in Samaria and was injured. So he sent messengers and said to them, "Go inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover from this injury."
So this, like I say, sets the stage for what's coming in chapter 1, but it just follows immediately what happened in 1 Kings chapter 22. 1 Kings chapter 22, we find going back to beginning in verse 29 down through verse 40, that Ahab has died. So the king in Israel over the 10 northern tribes has died, and now it's time for a new king. And we find who the new king is when we look at 1 Kings chapter 22. Somebody read verses 51 to 53.
Ahaziah, the son of Ahab, king of Israel and Samaria, in the 17th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and reigned 2 years over Israel. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of his father, and in the way of his mother, and in the way of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who had made Israel sin. For he served Baal and worshipped him, and provoked the Lord God of Israel to anger, according to all that his father had done.
Typically, we see this type of a summary of one of the king's lives at the end of their life. But for Ahaziah, we find it at the beginning, right? The first time we read about Ahaziah, we are immediately told what kind of a king was he.
Horrible.
He was a horrible king, right? He followed in the footsteps of his father Ahab. And was Ahab a great guy or no? No, not really. And so we recognize the type of king, the type of actions, the type of man that Ahaziah was. So it should come as no surprise when we get into 2 Kings chapter 1. We're looking at somebody who lived and acted as if there is no God. Someone who, in that sense, doesn't believe there is a God.
I think this is the only time that it's mentioned that he followed it, that someone follows in the way of their mother as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like every other time, it's in the way of their father.
Mm-hmm.
But she was so bad that they had to mention her in the way that he followed it. She was so evil. Was she torn apart by dogs or eaten?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, eaten by dogs. God sent the dogs to eat her. And so she was so bad. This is the only time in the Bible that it's mentioned that someone followed in the way of their mother.
Yes,
They
not
were so
only
evil.
was Ahab not doing the right, but Jezebel definitely wasn't. And even as we looked, and Jared brought out at different times, looking through with Ahab and different things going on, it seemed like a lot of Ahab's problem was actually Jezebel. That he was doing what she wanted and following her lead. And, Jared brought out really good points through that. If you weren't able to be here for that study of 1 Kings, most all of them are on YouTube. So I'd encourage you can go back, read through some of that. You go through and you're like, I wonder more about that. Jared probably talked about it.
He'll be going through it again at the academy.
Yeah, and he's going to go through it at the academy. And actually, he'll be covering some of this in 2 Kings and 1 and 2 Chronicles as well. And so that'll be coming up this next quarter there at the Lamb's Academy. But we can recognize coming into 2 Kings, Ahaziah is not a good king. Ahaziah doesn't act as if there is a God, because why would he? Because who did he serve and worship? Baal, false god. Interesting, because what happened during the reign of his father, 1 Kings chapter 18? Baal was proved to be a false god. That the God of Israel was the true God.
Maybe he was sleeping.
Maybe so. But it didn't change anything, did it? Ahaziah clearly didn't learn the lesson because his father didn't learn the lesson, neither did his mother. But you look at verse 1 of 2 Kings chapter 1, and what are we told that's happening? There's rebellion, right? It says Moab rebelled against Israel after the death of Ahab. We'll see if this still works after I just dropped it. It does. All right. Here's a little bit of a map. I know the colors might make it a bit of a challenge to read. But this is kind of what was going on in the days of the divided kingdom. And so the pink, you got Israel, the northern tribes, and then you have Judah. And of course, you got all the nations around. This darker one that you really can't hardly read at all, that's Moab. So Moab was under Israel, that they were basically servants of Israel doing everything for them, but Ahab dies, and what do the people of Moab decide?
No more.
We're going to throw off the yoke, right? We're done with it. We're not serving y'all anymore. Time for rebellion. So you have this going on, and in the background of all of that, what's happening at the palace back in Samaria?
Fell through the roof.
Ahaziah falls through the roof. Of course, we look at it and we read it, and in our minds, we're thinking the roof here. Some of what I found on it suggests maybe it was almost more like a window in the way they would do their construction. But you just kind of had more of an open area where the breeze could come through, usually always up on the second floor, and Ahaziah falls right through. So you got all of that going on, and like I say, you have this rebellion. Ahaziah falls through the roof. How's he going to lead his nation when he's concerned about his health? And that's what we know you're going to have through the chapter. He's concerned about his health. But I wanted to also show this. 2 Kings chapter 3 deals more with the particular rebellion from Moab. But this is a archaeological find. The Moabite stone, or the Mesha Stela, is actually in the, if I remember right, I think in the Louvre in Paris. So if you ever find yourself in Paris, France, not Paris, Texas, you may be lucky enough to go to the Louvre and see it with your own eyes. But basically what the stone talks about is this particular rebellion, the conquest of the Moabite king at that time. And actually on the stone it talks back to how Moab would have fallen under subjection to Israel under the days of King Omri. That's something we don't read about in the Kings. But we know at this point that obviously if they rebelled, they had to have come under subjection to Israel at some point. But like I say, on this particular stone, it actually says when that took place. And so that's something that, again, looking at secular history tells us these things we're reading about in the Bible are history. It's not made up, but these are real things that were going on. Ahaziah was a real king in a real area dealing with a real rebellion, and now dealing with a real health problem because he fell through the roof or the window of the upper floor of his room. And when he falls through, verse 2, of that upper room in Samaria and is injured, what's he do?
He sends for the Baal god helper.
He sends his messengers to go to Ekron to inquire of Beelzebub, am I going to live or am I going to die? Where should he have gone? To God.
In prayer.
But why doesn't he go to God?
We don't believe in
He doesn't really believe in God, right? He's more convinced of the false god. Beelzebub was basically what that name means is Lord of the Flies. There are different things I read, kind of trying to figure out more about it. But essentially, what the thought would have been was that as Lord of the Flies, it would drive out any impurities, it would drive away sickness. And so he sends his messengers to this Lord of the Flies to try and figure out, am I going to live? Am I going to die? Ekron itself was about 60 miles or so. I think I may have that on this. Yeah. Was about 60 miles or so from Samaria. So again, I know it's small in some of it, hard to read on some of it. But this was kind of the general region where Samaria would have been, palace somewhere in here. And then Ekron is down here in the land of the Philistines. Beelzebub would have been the primary god of the people there in Ekron. There's a temple to him. Might think back to 1 Samuel 5, 1 Samuel 6 with Dagon, when the Ark of the Covenant was brought into the temple of Dagon in the city of Ashdod. So the Philistines had in their different cities different gods for different cities, different temples in their main places. And in Ekron, it's this Lord of the Flies. That's where Ahaziah is sending his messengers to figure out, am I going to live? Am I going to die? We're about out of time here, but something that we can be thinking about until our next class. And next Sunday, Jared's going to be teaching. I'm going to be out of town the next couple of Sundays, so Jared will take the Sunday morning class. And then beginning not this Wednesday, but the following Wednesday, I'm going to take the Wednesday night classes so we can kind of stay on our routine and schedule that way. But then, anyway, say all that to say, at our next class, be thinking about some of the ways and places in which we turn before we turn to God. Because if we're not careful, we can quickly become like Ahaziah. And a problem pops up in our life, and we go somewhere else before we go to who we should go to. And so that's something for us to think about, something for you to be thinking on until our next class. We'll go ahead and we'll stop right there and pick up in 2 Kings chapter 1 and verse 3, Lord willing, at our next class.
Thank you, Preston. Great class.